The first thing Claire did that morning was slide my car keys farther away from my hand. She did it neat, almost absent-minded, while setting down the breakfast casserole she'd brought over in a foil pan from Kroger. If you weren't looking straight at it, you might have called it nothing, but I was looking straight at it. 3 days out of the hospital, standing in my own kitchen in Chillicothe with my coffee cooling beside the toaster, I watched my daughter-in-law move my keys 2 feet down the counter like they had no business being near me. Then she smiled and said I made the egg one you like, Walter. She never called me Walter unless she wanted something softened. The kitchen still smelled faintly like bleach from the night before. I'd wiped everything down myself after supper because I don't like waking up to a dirty sink. The March light came in gray through the window over June's old herb shelf, catching the dust on the blinds and the little chip on the sugar bowl lid. My son David was at the table in his work fleece with one elbow propped up, scrolling his phone with the sound off. He looked tired, or guilty. At my age, you learn those can wear some of the same clothes. You didn't have to bring breakfast, I said. Claire peeled back the foil. You're not supposed to be doing too much yet. I looked at her, then at David. Making toast is still inside my skill set. David gave a little laugh through his nose, but never raised his eyes. Claire laughed too, the way people do when they don't want a thing to become a thing. Nobody had told me not to drive. Nobody at the hospital had told me not to make my own breakfast. What they'd told me was that I'd passed out because I'd let myself get run down, dehydrated, and stubborn in the same week. 4 days under fluorescent lights and bad coffee because I'd spent too long fixing a downspout in cold rain and then forgot lunch. That was the size of it. Embarrassing, maybe, but not the beginning of the end. Claire scooped casserole onto a plate and set it in front of me before I'd asked for one. Sit down while it's hot. I sat because I didn't feel like having a tug-of-war in my kitchen at 8:30 in the morning. June used to say that was my worst habit as a father and husband, the way I'd step around small things to keep the day from turning sour. You confuse peace with wisdom. Sometimes, she told me once, standing at this same sink with her sleeves rolled up, rinsing green beans for Sunday supper. I'd laughed then. Said something about everybody in the family not needing 2 hard heads. That was 8 years before she got sick and 4 years before she died. And I could still hear the faucet running while she said it. Claire sat across from me but kept half rising every few seconds, straightening the napkin holder, nudging the salt shaker back in line, picking a breadcrumb off the table. That woman could organize a room right out of the air. David finally put his phone face down and said, "How'd you sleep?" "Fine." "You sure I've been sleeping in that room since Carter was in office?" I said. "I know what fine feels like." Claire cut in before David answered. "He was up twice." I turned my head. "You in the bedroom now?" She blinked, then smiled again. The hallway light was on when I came by early. I got up to use the bathroom. David picked up his fork. "Nobody's saying there's anything wrong with that, Dad." There it was, that little phrase. Nobody's saying. The kind that lets a person put words in the air without owning them. We ate a minute in silence. The wall clock over the pantry ticked louder than it usually did. Claire had set the table with paper napkins instead of the cloth ones June kept in the drawer by the oven. That bothered me more than it should have. Paper napkins are for cookouts, not a kitchen table. Claire took a sip of coffee and said I was thinking maybe for a while we should keep things simple. No driving, no ladders, nothing in the garage without David here. I set my fork down. "Who told you no driving?" The hospital was concerned. The hospital has a lot of concerns. Which person exactly? She looked at David, and that look told me more than the answer. It was quick, but I caught it. A handoff. He rubbed the back of his neck and stared at the condensation ring under his mug. "It's just temporary," he said, "until we know more." Know more about what? Neither of them answered that straight. Claire started talking about follow-up appointments, blood pressure, being careful at my age. At my age? 4 words that can turn a man into furniture if said with enough confidence. After breakfast, David carried the plates to the sink, though I hadn't asked him to, and Claire went into the den with her handbag and one of those legal pads she always carried. I stayed at the table longer than I needed to, listening to cupboard doors open and close in a house where I knew every hinge by sound. There are changes in a home you feel before you see them. June's house plants gone. Her coats no longer on the hall rack, the way quiet sits different after a funeral, and then smaller ones. A chair angled wrong, a drawer shut too firmly by somebody who doesn't know its temper. A voice lowering in the next room. I stood up slow more for pride than dizziness and took my mug to the sink. My keys were still down at the far end of the counter beside the basket where I kept junk mail and the church bulletin from last Sunday. I picked them up and dropped them in my shirt pocket. Claire came back in just then. Her eyes went to my pocket and then away. You don't need those this morning. That wasn't your call yesterday, and it isn't your call today. David stepped into the kitchen like he'd been waiting for the sound of trouble. Dad, what? We're just trying to help. That word gets stretched thin in families. Help. It can mean bringing soup. It can mean changing a tire. It can also mean standing in a man's kitchen and making him ask permission to be himself. I didn't say that. I said, then help by letting me finish my own morning. Claire put both palms on the counter. Nobody's trying to take anything from you. Maybe it was the way she said it. Too soon, too polished, like an answer laid out before the question. I looked at David. I wasn't talking to you, I said to her. I was talking to my son. He shifted his weight and reached for his mug. Claire's only worried because you scared us. I scared myself too, I said. Difference is, I don't intend to turn one bad afternoon into a new job title. His jaw tightened. Not anger. Embarrassment. My boy had been embarrassed easy since high school, especially by anything messy or loud or unresolved. June saw that clearer than I ever did. She said once that David wasn't cruel, which made it worse in some ways. Cruel men you can square off with. Soft men will let the room do ugly things for them while they keep their hands clean. Claire said, maybe we should all take a breath. I almost laughed. That sort of sentence always lands from somebody who's already got the upper hand. By 11, they'd gone quiet enough for me to think maybe the morning had passed. David was on a work call in the den. Claire had stepped out to run one errand, though her coat was still on the hook. I went looking for the electric bill because I like to pay it on Thursdays, and I kept that month's envelope under the seed catalog on the kitchen desk. The desk looked wrong before I touched it. The notepad had been moved square with the edge. June used to keep it crooked because she tore grocery lists off with one hand. The small brass bowl where I dropped change had been pushed back an inch. Under the seed catalog was a glossy brochure, folded in thirds. Cream-colored paper. Smiling older couple on a bench beneath a red bud tree. Maple Grove Senior Living, Circleville, Ohio. I stood there with that thing in my hand and felt the room go very still around me. Then, from the den, thinking I was outside or deaf, or already halfway gone, I heard Claire's voice, low and practical. If he takes the smaller room there, we won't have to move everything at once. We can sort the garage after the walk-through. I didn't move. David said something too soft for me to catch. Claire answered clearer this time. Thursday at 2. The realtor said that's best. Thursday at 2. I stood there with that brochure in my hand and the seed catalog slipping against my palm, and for one strange second I thought of June labeling tomato steaks with a black marker that always dried out too soon. That was how the mind worked when it got hit hard at my age. It reached for something steady before it let the bad thing all the way in. I folded the brochure once and laid it back where I'd found it. Then I walked to the den doorway. David was sitting on the edge of the sofa, leaning forward with his forearms on his knees. Claire stood near the bookcase with her legal pad in one hand and her phone in the other. Both of them looked up too fast. What walk-through? I asked. Claire opened her mouth first, but I held up a hand without looking at her. I asked my son. David stood. Dad, it's not what it sounds like. That sentence has never once made anything better. What walkthrough? He rubbed the back of his neck. We were just getting information. For what? Claire stepped in anyway. Walter. After what happened, we would be irresponsible not to look at options. Options for what? Nobody's making you do anything, she said. We're trying to think ahead. I looked at David. Say it plain. He let out a breath through his nose and glanced toward the window. We're talking about whether it still makes sense for you to be here alone. There it was. Not because the words were loud, they were almost careful. That made them land worse. I nodded once. And the realtor, Claire, answered. If a move ever became necessary, it would be smart to understand the value of the property. The property. My house reduced to 2 words you could put on a yellow folder. I'd built the back deck with June 1 July when the heat sat on the yard like a wet coat. I'd replaced every window in the place except the small one over the basement stairs because that frame never did sit square. June had painted the laundry room pale blue because she said even chores deserved one cheerful wall. 46 years in that house, and Claire said the property. David took 1 step toward me. Dad, you fainted in the driveway. I know where I fainted. I was there. His face tightened. That's not fair. No, I said. What's not fair is hearing strangers are coming to walk through my home before anybody saw fit to tell me. Claire crossed her arms, then uncrossed them, catching herself. You've been tired. We didn't want to upset you. That one made me laugh, but there wasn't any humor in it. You think a man gets less upset because you lie polite. David looked at the floor. That hurt worse than if he'd raised his voice. I should have said more. I should have drawn a line right there in the den with both of them standing in front of me. But there's a reason men like me stay quiet too long, and it isn't cowardice exactly. It's habit. It's years of being the one who smooths things enough to get supper on the table and everybody through Christmas without somebody storming out. It's believing one decent pause can still call decency out of another person. I kept waiting for my son to hear himself and stand up straight inside his own skin. Instead, he said, maybe we should talk after your follow-up next week. No, not Claire's wrong. Not Dad. This went too far. After. As if the thing wasn't already standing there in the room with us. I said, get out of my den. Claire drew back like I'd cursed at her. David's eyes came up at that, but only for a second. Then they gathered their things and moved toward the kitchen. He stopped once, half-turned maybe, to say something decent, but Claire touched his sleeve and whatever he might have been about to be passed out of him. I stood alone in the den and listened to the front door close. The house made its usual sounds after that. Refrigerator motor, clock in the hallway, a truck down on the road hitting the pothole by the mailbox. Ordinary sounds. That was the mean part. Life keeps sounding like itself when something under it has already shifted. I went back to the kitchen desk and looked through the discharge papers again. 3 stapled sections. Medication list. Follow-up instructions. Fluid intake. Blood pressure warning signs. That was all. Maybe that should have been enough. Maybe I should have let it sit. But now that I'd heard the words, smaller room and walk through the stack in my hand, felt too thin. June used to keep every paper that came into this house in manila envelopes with the month written on the front. She trusted records more than recollections. Memory loves comfort, she'd say, tapping a bill or warranty card against the counter. Paper doesn't care who cries. Back then, I'd smile and tell her not everybody needed to live like the county auditor. She was thinking farther ahead than I knew. By 2 o'clock, my sister Linda had come by with a chicken and noodles casserole in a glass dish wrapped with one of her faded dish towels. She took one look at my face and said, "What did they do now?" I let her in and set the casserole on the stove. You always did skip the hymn and head right for confession. I'm too old to waste time on weather talk when somebody's jaw looks like that. We sat at the kitchen table where the paper napkins were still out from breakfast. I told her enough. Not every word, just enough. The brochure, the realtor, The talk about Circleville. Linda didn't interrupt me once. That was one of the best things about her. When I finished, she reached over and turned June's old sugar bowl around so the chipped side faced the wall. "Your wife saw this coming," she said. The sentence went into me like a cold tool. I looked out the window over the sink at the muddy backyard and the rusted wheelbarrow tipped against the fence. She said he'd choose the easy way if easy was offered. Linda nodded. "You told her she worried too much." I remember what I told her. June had said it one night after David cancelled on helping me move a refrigerator for the church pantry because Claire had found concert tickets and he didn't want to waste them. It wasn't the tickets that bothered June. It was the ease with which he'd let somebody else carry what he'd promised to carry. I'd defended him, said he worked hard, said young couples had their own lives, said not every disappointment was a character flaw. Linda folded her hands on the table. "This isn't about the hospital anymore. I know that. It's about whether your son can stand being uncomfortable long enough to tell his wife no." I didn't answer. She looked at the papers near my elbow. "That all they gave you, I spread them out." She read slower than she used to, tilting her glasses down her nose. "Seems light?" "That's what I thought." "Well, call." So I did. Not right away. I made coffee first because I needed something hot in my hands. Then I dialed the hospital number off the discharge sheet and sat through 3 transfers and a stretch of hold music that sounded like a church keyboard played underwater. Medical records answered with a woman named Teresa. I told her my name, my date of birth, the dates I'd been admitted. I told her I wanted my full discharge documentation, including anything from case management or social work. There was a pause, paper shuffling keyboard clicks. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "it looks like there are additional notes in your file that weren't included in the summary packet." I felt Linda's eyes come up from across the table. "What kind of notes? Discharge planning? Care coordination? That sort of thing? I'd like all of it." "Yes, sir. You can pick up a complete copy in person with ID, or we can mail it. I'll come get it." After I hung up, Linda said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "There it is." I hated the way my stomach dropped. Not because I'd been wrong, because I hadn't been wrong enough. Some part of me had still been hoping Claire was filling in blanks with her usual controlling nature, and David was just letting himself be dragged behind her. Missing notes meant structure. It meant process. It meant somebody had known there was more to the story and not handed it to me anyway. Linda stood and reached for her purse. "I'll go with you tomorrow. I can go by myself. I know you can. That's not the point." But it was the point in a way. Every hour now seemed to divide clean into 2 kinds, things I could still do by myself and things other people had already decided I shouldn't. That night, I didn't turn on the television. I sat in June's chair in the den with the lamp on beside me and listened to the furnace kick in and out. Around 9, David texted, "You okay?" Not, "Are you angry?" Not, "Can I come talk?" Not, "Dad, this went too far." "You okay?" I looked at the phone a long time before setting it face down on the end table. The next morning, the sky was low and white, with that damp Ohio look that makes every mailbox and utility pole seem tired. I drove myself to Adana Regional, parked in the visitor lot, and walked in with my license in my wallet and my shoulders as square as I could keep them. At the records desk, a woman in purple scrubs slid a thick envelope toward me through the opening in the glass. "Full file copy, Mr. Mercer." It was heavier than the stack I'd been sent home with, heavier than it ought to have been. I took it to a row of molded chairs under a muted television showing a cooking show nobody was watching. My fingers felt stiff against the flap. I opened the envelope, pulled out the clipped packet, and turned past the pages I already knew. Case management notes. The first line I saw made the whole waiting room seem to tilt a little. Patient, alert and oriented ×4. Demonstrates sound judgment. Safe for independent discharge home. I read that line 3 times before the words settled into their full shape. Safe for independent discharge home. Not maybe. Not with monitoring. Not if family feels more comfortable. Safe. A woman in navy slacks and a cream cardigan stepped out from a side office and looked toward me. She had a badge clipped at her waist and reading glasses hanging from a cord around her neck. "Mr. Mercer." I looked up. "I'm Marlene Keating. I handled discharge planning on your floor." She took in the packet in my hand, then the look on my face. "Do you have a minute?" I followed her into a little office with one fake plant, 2 guest chairs, and a desk that held exactly what needed holding and nothing more. That kind of neatness always calmed me a little. It did not calm me then. She sat and folded her hands. "I remember you because you asked to read everything yourself. Most people just nod and want to get home. I like knowing what I'm agreeing to." "Yes, sir." She tilted the packet toward her and tapped the note with one finger. "You were alert. You answered appropriately. You understood your medication instructions, and there was no recommendation from my office for assisted living or supervised placement." I heard myself say, "My son's wife told me the hospital was concerned I shouldn't be alone." Marlene's face changed, not into shock exactly, but into something tired and knowing. "That is not what I documented." I looked at her across the desk. "Did you tell my family anything that could have sounded like that I told them what I tell most families after a scare like yours? Follow-up matters, hydration matters, rest matters. I did not recommend placement, and I did not document a cognitive safety concern." The office got very quiet. I could hear a cart rolling somewhere down the hall and the soft squeak of one wheel needing oil. I thought about June, how she used to say the truth often came without any music behind it. Just a sentence in a room. Then your life had to rearrange itself around it. "Thank you," I said. Marlene nodded. "You're welcome." I drove home slower than usual, not because I felt weak, but because I wanted the road to last a little longer than it did. State Route 50 ran damp and flat under a low sky. Brown fields, telephone poles, a pickup ahead of me with a feed store sticker in the back window. Ordinary Ohio things. It struck me that I had spent half my life believing the real injuries came with raised voices, slamming doors, men making fools of themselves in public. But no. Sometimes a man lost more to lowered voices and planning. Claire's SUV was in my driveway when I pulled in. Beside it sat a silver sedan with a magnetic sign on the door for Harlan Ridge Senior Living. In the kitchen window I could see movement, Claire's shape, David's shoulders. I left the packet on the passenger seat and went inside. Claire turned at once. "Walter, there you are." "We were just talking through Saturday morning," I said. She blinked. "Excuse me. You want to talk through something in my house? You can do it Saturday morning. 9 o'clock. Everybody who needs to hear it can hear it then." David stood up from the table. "Dad, I don't think—" "No," I said. "You don't." "Saturday." The woman from the sedan, mid-50s, maybe kind-faced, nice shoes, not made for mud, rose halfway from her chair. "Mr. Mercer, I'm sure this can be arranged another time." "It will be," I said. "Saturday." Claire's mouth tightened. She wasn't used to direct refusals, especially not from me. I walked to the sink, set my hand flat on the counter, and looked out at the backyard until they understood I was done for the day. Linda came over that evening. She didn't ask many questions once I showed her the notes. She read them once through, then again slower. "Well," she said finally. "There it is in black and white." "Yes." "You going to hand this to Claire or to your son?" I looked down at the pages. My son. That's right. I slept badly, not from nerves, from memory. June folding laundry on the couch and saying without malice, David always hopes somebody else will carry the harder part. Me defending him. Me saying he'd grow into himself. Me wanting that badly enough to call it truth before it was earned. Saturday morning came raw and wet, with a steady rain that ticked against the gutters and darkened the driveway to the color of old slate. I put on a clean flannel shirt, shaved slower than usual, and made a full pot of coffee. By 8:30, the kitchen smelled the way it used to on church mornings, coffee toast, damp wool drying on hooks by the door. At 9 sharp, Claire came in first, carrying a folder. David followed with his shoulders already rounded. The woman from Harlan Ridge came in after them, and behind her, a man in a navy quarter zip with a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. Realtor. I'd never met him, but I knew the breed. Cheerful around thresholds, Linda sat at the far end of the table with her hands around a mug. I took my seat at the head where June used to say I sat like a county commissioner, even when I was only carving ham. Nobody touched the coffee. Claire began in that smooth voice of hers. Walter, we're all here because we care about making sure you're safe and comfortable after your recent episode. The Harlan Ridge woman gave a small nod. The realtor offered me a sympathetic smile I had not earned and did not want. I let Claire speak for another 30 seconds, long enough for her to say transition support, realistic options, and quality of life. Then I opened the manila envelope in front of me and slid one packet across the table to David. Read that out loud. His hand stopped halfway to it. Dad, read it. Claire leaned forward. What is this? The truth, I said. Something I had to go back to the hospital myself to get. David picked up the packet. His fingers looked thick and clumsy against the paper. He read the heading first, almost under his breath. Case management notes, he said. Louder, Linda said. His face went dark red, but he cleared his throat and started again. Patient alert and oriented ×4. Demonstrates sound judgment. Safe for independent discharge home. The room went so still I could hear rain tapping the window over the sink. Keep going, I said. He swallowed. No supervised placement recommended at this time. Patient understands medication and follow-up instructions. No cognitive concerns documented during discharge planning. The realtor lowered his eyes to the table. The woman from Harlan Ridge straightened in her chair and looked from David to Claire, then to me. Claire recovered first. Walter, nobody hid anything. We were trying to be proactive. I turned to the woman from Harlan Ridge. Ma'am, were you told the hospital recommended supervised placement? She hesitated. I was told there were safety concerns after discharge. By who? Claire jumped in. This is getting unnecessarily adversarial. No, I said. What got unnecessary was bringing strangers into my kitchen to talk about where I ought to be put while the hospital had already cleared me to stay in my own home. David stared at the notes in his hand, like they might rewrite themselves if he waited. I looked at him, not Claire. Did you know? He said nothing. Did you know these notes existed? His jaw moved once. Claire said the hospital summary covered everything important. David. My voice didn't rise, but it cut sharper than if it had. Did you know they said I was safe to come home? His eyes finally met mine. I knew they said you were doing better. That was the last little fiction dying right there between us. If concern was all this was, I said, then why was there a realtor in my driveway before there was one honest conversation in my house? Nobody answered. The Harlan Ridge woman closed her folder. Mr. Mercer, I think I may have been brought in too early. That makes 2 of us, I said. The realtor stood embarrassed enough to move quick. I'll just see myself out. Claire turned on him at once. There's no need to be dramatic. He gave her a look that said he'd heard enough and did not care to hear more. Then he left. The woman from Harlan Ridge rose more slowly. Mr. Mercer, I apologize for any misunderstanding. It wasn't yours, I said. After she left, only family remained in the kitchen. Rain, coffee gone cold. Linda still quiet at the far end. Claire gathered her papers with stiff hands. You're making this into something cruel. That almost made me smile. No, I'm putting it back into what it was before you dressed it up. David sat like a man who had just discovered there was no floor under the plank he'd chosen to stand on. I said, "You let me walk around my own house while plans were made over my head. You let her answer for me. You let me hear about my life from the next room." His eyes shined then, but I had no use left for tears. Not the easy kind. "I didn't think it would go this far," he said. June had been right, not because he was vicious, because he was weak in the place where a man is supposed to bear weight. "You didn't stop it early," I said. "That's how things go far." Claire reached for his sleeve, but he pulled away this time. Too late to help him, but I noticed it. I stood up. "You're not arranging another meeting in this house. You're not bringing another folder through that door, and as long as I'm living here, you will speak to me, not around me. Is that understood?" Claire said nothing. David nodded once, small and miserable. Linda rose and carried the untouched coffee pot to the sink like the morning had finally earned an ordinary gesture. They left 10 minutes later. No slamming doors, no speeches, just wet footsteps across the porch and the sound of Claire's SUV backing down the drive. I stood at the kitchen window until both vehicles were gone. After a while, I went out to the garage. The rain had softened to a steady patter on the open edge of the door. June's old gardening tools hung where they always had. Small shovel hand raked the green gloves with dirt still caught in the seams from some spring I could no longer date exactly. I put my hand on the workbench and listened to the rain and the house settling behind me. It was still mine. That was satisfaction enough to feel in the bones. But June had been gone 4 years, and now the last easy lie about my son was gone too. I stood there a long time with the smell of damp earth coming in from the yard and the sound of water ticking from the gutter chain into the peonies June planted by the side wall. The silence felt different than it had the week before. Not cheerful, not healed, just protected. At my age, that can be enough to call peace by its right name.